We're here to talk to you today about how to create accessible, interactive web apps using HTML5.
Slide 3 feedback, please provide.
And you can hear that this talk is going to be accessible. We've got some speech turned on. If you have any feedback, here's the link for feedback and for hashtags if you'd like to blog about this. So to start things off, one way that you can make your web app accessible is to keep things really simple. Use basic HTML, very simple, easy to understand layouts. And every time that the user wants to make a change, you can reload the page by submitting a form.
But I mean, that sounds kind of boring. We want to build web apps that are interactive and dynamic and fun for our users to use. We want to build web apps that feel just like native apps. And there's no reason why these interactive dynamic web apps can't be accessible to users with disabilities. So who are the users that we're talking about during this talk? We're going to be addressing three broad groups of users during this talk: blind users, users with low vision, and users who are motor impaired and can't use a mouse. We're going to be talking about these three groups of users, even though there are lots of other users with different disabilities that also affect how they'll use our apps. Because at least for these three groups, we know something very valuable, and that's exactly how they're going to access our page. Users who are blind will use a screen reading software that describes the page using synthesized speech or Braille output. Users with low vision will use large fonts or a screen magnifier, which increases the size of the currently focused area of the page. And users who are motor impaired will generally use a special keyboard or some kind of voice control interface. And these three groups of users have one big thing in common, and that's that none of them are going to be using a mouse to access your page. So it's really important when we're building our apps that we don't make that assumption, that we don't assume that our users are using a mouse, because for these three groups of users, that's just not the case. And for these three groups of users, there really are no workarounds. If our web app doesn't work with their assistive technology, there's really not a whole lot of recourse for them. So that's why it's important for us to get this right the first time. And in this talk, we're going to tell you how you can do just that.
So let me give you an overview of what we're going to be talking about during this session. First, we want to show you what we think is a great accessible experience. First of all, how it can go wrong, and then how we think that experience can be really good. Next, we're going to talk about the actual code, how you can write your HTML and your JavaScript to make things accessible, like in our example. And finally, we're going to be talking about browser extensions and other tools and resources that you as developers can use to make accessible web apps. So let's start off by talking about what is a great accessible experience.
So I'm going to jump in for a minute and talk to you exactly how we're going to be demoing our apps and our code to you today. Some of you might have noticed, although this podium's hiding it, I'm running this presentation on a CR48 Chrome notebook. And one of the really great things about Chrome OS, and something that we announced at I/O, is that it includes a built-in screen reader called ChromeVox that was developed by Dominic and my team at Google. ChromeVox is implemented as a Chrome extension, which means that we wrote it in just JavaScript, CSS, and HTML. And as you can imagine, it was built for the web. So we're going to be using it to do our demos for you today. For those of you who aren't familiar with how a screen reader works, essentially, I'm going to be using keyboard commands to move focus around the page and explore both static text and interactive elements with ChromeVox. ChromeVox and other screen readers work really well with web forms, with static text and native HTML elements. So I'm going to demonstrate ChromeVox on this embedded web form in this slide for you right now. The first thing I'm going to do is unmute ChromeVox, because it's been running this entire time.
Slide 9, accessibility for the static web screen readers and
So what I'm doing is I'm just using the ChromeVox modifier keys, Shift and Search, and using the arrow keys to move ChromeVox down through the page. And I'm actually going to activate the lens to show you what ChromeVox is speaking in case you can't hear it.
Because it's very hard to understand, especially over speakers here.
Screen readers and magnifiers allow the user to explore both static. Here's an example web form to demonstrate.
So I'm going to enter the form, and you can see how ChromeVox interacts with interactive elements.
Enter your name, editable text. Red, choose your favorite color. Combo box 1 of 10.
So I'm going to choose my favorite color using the arrow keys.
Orange 2 of 10. Yellow 3 of 10. Green 4 of 10. Submit button. Having trouble? Click here for help. Link.
So that was great. ChromeVox jumped through, it read to me the static text, and it jumped into each of the focusable controls, told me what the control was, and told me how I could interact with it.
I'm going to jump in and say one more thing here, which is that for people who have low vision, they might be using a tool called a magnifier, which works in a very similar way. instead of listening to the speech and the sound effects that you heard, they're simply going to be looking at a magnified version of one part of the page, kind of like the lens you see at the top. So the experience is very similar. The idea is you're focusing on one part of the page at a time and having it described to you, or magnified or enhanced in some way.
And the great news here is that if the web app you're building looks just like this form, then congratulations, your website will be accessible, and a user can use a screen reader to go through all of your editable text and buttons. But if your web app is maybe a little bit more exciting, if it has a little bit more going on and it's a little bit more complex, then we do have to do some extra work in order to give our users a good experience. And that's what we're going to talk to you about.
So let's start by talking about a bad experience. So in contrast to that form, this is certainly not a complex app, but this is an app that uses a few more interactive capabilities that you find in just about every interactive Web 2.0 app today. So this is a little app we built called Snack Attack, and the idea is simply you're going to scroll through these list of choices and vote on the ones that are your favorite for hacking all night long. So I'm going to first demonstrate this from the perspective that most web developers would be thinking about, which is someone who's using a mouse and who is fully sighted, able to see this page. So I'm going to look at this page and look through these choices. And some coffee sounds really good right now, so I'm going to click on coffee. And now a dialog box appeared. Now, as web developers, we all know this isn't a native dialog box, but it feels like a dialog box because it appeared over top of the page, everything else was sort of dimmed, and there's some controls for me to interact with. So this is good. It wants me, I see some stars, and it looks like this is an opportunity for me to rate this. I'll give this 4 stars. And there's a vote and a cancel button. I click vote. Now it says saving, and the dialog box disappears. So far, this sounds like a great experience. Now, let's suppose that the only limitation I have is that I'm unable to use a mouse. Millions of people out there do all of their computer use using only a keyboard. They might even have some type of special assistive device that simulates a keyboard. So I'm just going to press Tab. And as I press Tab, you'll notice that various focusable controls on the page are being highlighted. So let's try the exact same experience. I go here to coffee, and I hit enter, and the dialog box appears. So far, so good. Now let's say I want to actually interact with the dialog. I'm going to press Tab again. Nothing happened. I'm going to hit it again. Oh, this is terrible. The focus is behind the dialog. So this is a poor experience for me as a keyboard user. But maybe if I'm clever and I keep pressing Tab, or Shift Tab in this case, I eventually find myself inside the dialog. And you'll notice now vote is focused. So I'm inside the dialog, but it's not a great experience for me. But how about the star rating gadget? Can I interact with that? Well, no, it just skips right past it. So this page is basically inaccessible to me as someone where my only limitation is that I can't use a mouse. Unfortunately, it can be even worse than that. So let's turn ChromeVox back on again. And now I'm going to interact with the same page as a blind user.
Sign up, link. About, link. Contact us, link.
We can turn on the lens to see exactly what it's saying.
Pizza delivery, link. Caffeinated soda, link.
So let's suppose that I want to click on one of these.
Clicked.
So I just clicked on one of those links, and the dialog box appeared, but unfortunately, nothing else was spoken, nothing else was said. So I don't have any idea as a blind user what just happened. A dialog box might have appeared, something could have happened, it could have done something, but I don't know what happened. If I were to continue to explore the page, I might discover that there's some things on the page.
Cancel button.
I might discover that this cancel button and this vote button weren't there before. And I notice there's something here that says no rating, so I might be able to infer that there's some sort of ratings gadget. But if I were to press a bunch of keys, there would be no way for me to actually interact with it. And I don't even know what type of gadget that is. And one last thing. Oops. Hit the wrong key. I'm sorry about that. One last thing is that if I hit the vote button, it doesn't say that it's been saving anything. So this is the last problem with this experience. So as you can see, we have a lot of work to do in order to make this experience accessible. Let's mute everything here. So what went wrong? We had poor focus management. We had an unusable custom control that didn't have keyboard commands for me to interact with. And there was no explanation to the user when things changed on the page, like a dialog box appearing or a saving message appearing.
So what should have happened? First of all, we should have been managing our focus better. We want the user to fill out the dialog, so when the user clicked the button, we should have thrown focus inside of that dialog so that the user could then interact with it. We should also have made sure that focus stayed inside the dialog, so the user wouldn't accidentally fall out of the dialog as they're exploring. The second thing we need to do is make sure that we could use the keyboard to interact with our custom controls. You saw that that star rating widget didn't accept any keyboard input at all. And so that's really bad for these users that aren't using a mouse, they're using the keyboard. Controls need to be labeled for screen readers. You saw that Chromevox didn't even recognize that that gadget was interactive at all. So someone who's using Chromevox wouldn't be able to figure out how to vote for a particular snack. And the way that we can actually label our custom controls is by using special markup, and we'll go more into that later. And finally, the user needs to be informed when things change on the page. There were two instances, the first when the dialog opened, and the second when the word saving appeared, that nothing was spoken by Chromevox at all. Those changes were happening outside of the currently focused area, and we can also add special markup to let the user know when those kinds of changes are happening.
So let's take another look this time with all those problems fixed and see what the experience can look like when we've made it accessible to the users with this type of assistive technology. I'm going to skip past the case of the keyboard-only user because you can sort of imagine the experience once you've seen the experience with a screen reader. So let's turn
HTML5, sign up, link.
So let's turn Chromevox back on, and I'm going to go through the exact same experience, and let's see what happens here.
About, contact, visited, caffeinated soda, button.
Okay, so now I've got something, I've chosen the item I want to click on. Let's see what happens when I click on this. Actually, I'll turn on the lens again so you can see it, hopefully. Let's just listen this time what happens when I click on something and enter a dialog.
Dialog, rating dialog. Please rate this snack. No rating min 0 max 5, slider.
So what it said there was, first of all, it said entering dialog, and then it told us that we're on a slider. Well, this is great. So a slider is a control that I'm already familiar with working with. And so if I were on any slider normally, I might use the arrow keys to interact with it. And in fact, this is going to work great.
1 star, you, bros. 2 stars, Meg.
So just by pressing the arrows, it's changing the value of the slider and reading the new value to me, and in addition to the value, also some sort of description for it. So this is great. Now let's hit the vote button and see what happens here.
Clicked. Saving.
So notice that it said saving, which is great. So basically everything that happened on this page also had a great accessible experience to go along with it. And again, this is nothing super fancy or complicated. We want to show that this is something that's not very mysterious, and it's not that hard to imagine. With some simple changes, you can make sure that all users can get the same great interactive experience with your site.
Slide 12 HTML5.
So let's go on to the second part here, which is how to code accessible HTML5. So as an overview, there are 4 basic areas we want to talk about in order to create accessible HTML5. First of all, we just want you to use clean HTML and standard tags whenever possible. This is just a good solid foundation to build on. Then the next step is to manage focus, and then add keyboard handlers for custom controls that need it. And then finally, once you have that experience as a baseline, you can add ARIA, which is a new HTML5 markup for screen readers. We found it works really well if you do it in that order.
The first step that you want to think about when you're developing an app is clean HTML and standard tags. And this might seem like really basic advice, but it's really important for these users who are basically navigating the page by moving focus around. Using CSS for layout, making sure that your content and layout are separated, and making sure that your DOM order is logical means that you're writing cleaner HTML. And cleaner HTML is actually more accessible HTML. And so that's something that's important to remember. The second thing that we want to think about is don't reinvent the wheel. Don't use a generic div or span tag when there's a native HTML tag that's more appropriate. There's a lot of benefits to using native HTML tags that you don't get with generic divs or spans.
And I think a lot of web developers were in a habit. A few years ago, there were a lot of tags that weren't possible to style fully with CSS. But today, you can style everything with CSS, so there's no reason not to use the appropriate semantic tag.
And native HTML tags have focus and keyboard handling built in, so it means that you don't have to go back and add those later. And screen readers are really good at identifying native tags to users. And users are very good at interacting with those tags. So instead of doing extra work on a generic div or span, using a native tag at the beginning will save you down the road. And the final thing you want to think about is labeling your images and form controls. For an image, this means using an alt tag with a text description of the image, and for a form control, using the label tag. This is really basic advice, as I said before, but at the beginning of your app development process is the time to do this. Going back later, after you have a fully mature app, is really a huge pain, so it's better to do this as step one. Once you've got your clean HTML, you want to start thinking about focus. Focus management is really important for these users. And as I said before, it's better to use a native HTML tag, but often we do want to do more complex things that you can get with a bunch of divs and spans and on-click handlers. And that's fine, but we really need to make sure that those custom interactive controls that we're creating are focusable. Only link tags and native HTML tags receive focus by default. So anytime we're creating a control with a pile of divs and spans, we need to make sure that we're making it focusable. And the way that we do that is with tab index. I'm sure many of you already know how tab index works. We have a refresher for you up on the slide. But the really important thing to remember is just, if you're using a custom control, make sure it's focusable. Once you've done that, you want to start thinking about how you can manage your focus. And the way that you do that is with the JavaScript focus method. And you can also listen for focus events to make sure that you're managing focus after the user has started moving focus around the page. We did that in the demo by placing focus inside the dialog after it opened, and trapping focus inside the dialog after the user was interacting with it.
So once a control has focus, you'll want to make sure that someone can interact with that control using the keyboard just as easily as someone can interact with it using the mouse. If you're not sure what keys to use, sometimes the easiest thing to do is just to try out the native control that's most similar to the control that you're simulating, and try a bunch of keys on your keyboard. The arrow keys, page up, page down, escape, enter, space, and see what they do. But there's plenty of resources online on how to do this. The important thing is that when you're testing out your app, you should try unplugging your mouse and see what happens as you interact with things, and make sure that a keyboard user has the same experience. And luckily, this is very easy to do. We've given an example here where something that's clickable can also be activated using the space bar or the enter key.
Yeah, the important thing to remember there is that if you're listening for a click event, it's a good idea to try and think about listening for an enter event or a space event also. Once you've gotten your clean HTML, your focus, and your keyboard handling, it's time to start thinking about ARIA. And ARIA is markup that you add to your page to identify those fancy custom controls you created with divs and spans to a screen reader. As I said before, screen readers are really great with native tags like button. But when you have a bunch of generic tags, it's impossible for a screen reader to figure out what you mean by that pile of divs. You could be trying to build a button, or you could be trying to build something as complicated as a full menu interface. So ARIA markup is the tags that you add to your HTML in order to indicate to the screen reader how they should identify that control to the user. And there's two types of ARIA tags. The first one is called the ARIA role attribute. And you put that in your HTML to indicate what the generic tag that you're using is trying to be. So in this example, we've got a div that's acting as a button. So we have the ARIA role equals button. When a screen reader gets to that div, it will say that this is a send button. Roles are static, and you'd set these in your HTML like you see here. The other kind of ARIA property is called an ARIA state or property. ARIA states and properties add dynamic information about the current state of an element. So you see in this example, we have a div that we're using as a checkbox. So we have the ARIA role equals checkbox on that div, but we also have an ARIA state called ARIA-checked. And this tells the screen reader that not only is this div acting as a checkbox, but this div is currently checked. And so when the screen reader gets there, it will say that this is a checked checkbox. As you can imagine, ARIA states and properties are dynamic, and so you'd want to update these in your JavaScript as the control is being updated. In this slide, I want to talk about a more specific kind of ARIA tag, and that's the ARIA live region tag. We mentioned earlier that it's important to identify to users when things are changing on the page, maybe outside of the currently focused area. When you have changes on a page that are happening without a page refresh, you can identify them to a screen reader using live regions. In this example, you see that we have a span, and this is actually taken from the example that Dominic showed you where you clicked the vote button and it wrote the text saving. And we have an ARIA-live tag on this span. And that tells the screen reader that when the screen reader gets to this span, hey, this span is going to receive updates. So you should keep an eye on this span and speak any updates that happen to it. And you saw that Chromevox did that. When he clicked vote, Chromevox actually said saving. And so that tells the user extra information that they wouldn't have known if the ARIA live tag wasn't there. The value of the ARIA live tag is any number of different politeness levels. And I'm not going to go into too much detail on politeness levels, but the important thing to remember is it actually is a way of controlling how quickly the screen reader interrupts someone. So we've set it here to be polite, which means that Chromevox is going to wait until it's finished speaking what it's currently speaking before it interrupts the user and says saving. There are also certain ARIA roles that are considered live by default. Like in this example, the ARIA role equals alert. So it's just really important to kind of manage the different regions on your page that are changing without a page refresh, and ARIA Live will help you do that.
Okay, so we've given you a lot of ideas and talked about a lot of technical details, but there's nothing better than an actual example to see how this works, and how in many cases, how easy it is to make things fully accessible. So we've got a few examples we've prepared here, and we're going to start with a really simple one here. We've got a custom button. There are a lot of reasons why you might have something on the page that doesn't look like a button, but it essentially acts like a button. And just as a quick reminder, what's going to happen when we haven't had any accessible markup here, I'm going to turn Chromevox back on here.
Send refresh. Example 1, click on this button. Send.
So you notice when I got to the send button with Chromevox, it just said send. It didn't say it was a button, and in fact, if I would try to click on it, nothing would happen because it doesn't appear to be any type of focusable control. So let's make some changes here. The first change we want to make is we want to add tab index equals 0. And just by making that change, when I hit tab, now I can reach the send button. Now, you notice that screen readers will be able to reach things even if they aren't focusable. They just won't be able to interact with them. Now, someone can reach and interact with it. But we're not quite done here because we haven't described this as a button. So I'm going to add the ARIA tag role equals button. Now let's turn Chromevox back on.
Send button.
So now it describes it as a send button, and in fact,
button.
It's something that I can click on and interact with using Chromevox keys. So really simple example. What I haven't done here is a keyboard handler. So that would be the last step you'd need to do, is to handle the keyboard handler for someone who's not using a screen reader but can't use a mouse.
So I'm going to take the second example. This is another button. It's similar to the one Dominic just showed you. We've made it using a div and some CSS styling, and probably the first thing that we're going to want to do is also add tab index and the ARIA role. So I'm going to do that now. Tab index is, as I said before, really important. Anytime you're using a div or a span to make a custom control, you want to make sure you're setting tab index. And now I'm adding role equals button. And let's see what Chromevox does. This button is a little bit more complicated, so I'm going to have to do some extra work here.
Example 2, toggle button.
So that's great. It said toggle button. I'm going to click on it.
Clicked.
So it said clicked. That's awesome. But you'll notice that the button actually turned a different color. And that's because, as you might have guessed, this slide is called toggle button, and this is a toggle button. So when I move away from it, it's going to stay on.
Toggle button.
And when I moved Chromevox back to it, you'll notice that it just said toggle button. There was no indication to me that this button is currently pressed and that it's going to stay pressed. So this is an example of a place where you'd want to add an ARIA state, a dynamic property that changes based on whether the button is on or off. And when I add that, hopefully Chromevox will start telling me whether or not this button is on or off. And so, as I said before, we're going to want to set these states inside our JavaScript. I have this function here called toggle, and inside this first half of the if statement, I'm going to set the attribute aria-pressed. And I'm going to set it to false in this half. In the other half, I'm going to set the attribute to be true. True. And I'm also going to initialize it inside the HTML so that we can say that the default state of this button is off. False. OK, so let's try it out. Hopefully, things have improved a little bit. I'm turning Chromevox on.
Slide 21, example 3,
That is the
Slide
next
20
example.
Slide 21,
Spoiler
example
alert,
2.
okay.
Example 2, toggle button, toggle, button not pressed.
Okay, so you heard that Chromevox actually gave me a little bit more information. It said button not pressed. So when I click the button, let's see what happens.
Pressed.
So it says, instead of clicked, it says pressed. So I'm pressing the button. I'm gonna move away from it to the next link.
Refresh, button.
And now I'm gonna move back and let's see what happens.
Toggle, button pressed.
So that's great. It told me that the button was actually pressed. So this means that now we have a button that has a state that the screen reader will tell me what the current state of this button is. So it's building on a little bit Dominic's first example.
Let's do a couple more examples here. Actually, I think the next one's yours.
Oh, right. Oops. This next example is also mine. This is another button, but you'll notice that we've used a native button tag, so I don't have to go through and add tab index and roll again for the third time. That would be a little bit overkill. So we have this button, and let's just see what happens when I run Chromevox on it.
Slide 22, example 3, status indicator, click to begin calculation. Calculate, button.
All right, I'm going to press the button.
Clicked.
So, and silence from Chromevox. So clearly this button is setting off some kind of complicated calculation. The text box below the button says that it's calculating, and then about a second later it says that it's finished. But Chromevox was totally silent that entire time, so I as a user have no idea that anything happened at all. And some of you might be guessing that the way to fix this is by using ARIA live regions, because this div with the ID of status down there is what's receiving these text updates. So I'm going to add the ARIA-live attribute. I'm going to set it to be polite because we don't want to be rude. And let's see how Chromevox does.
Click to begin calculate, button.
OK, I'll click calculate.
Clicked. Calculating. Finished.
Great, so this is awesome. Chromevox said that it was calculating, and then it said it was finished. So I, as the user, now have a better idea of what's actually going on this page.
So you can see that with just a few simple changes based on HTML standards, you can make some big changes to the user experience that people get when they're using assistive technology. Let's take a couple of other examples. This one's a little bit more complicated, but let's talk about how we made the star rating gadget from the dialog earlier accessible. You might recall that we decided to make it into a slider because that was sort of the closest control that's already part of ARIA that users are already familiar with that sort of simulates what the experience of working with this custom widget is like. So I'm not even going to show you the inaccessible experience because without making any changes, as you can imagine, this would be completely inaccessible to a screen reader or to a keyboard user. So let's start making some changes here. The first one is tab index equals 0. The second one here is role equals slider. And just that change alone is going to be enough for Chromevox to announce that it's a slider. But that's not enough in order to describe the current state of the control. So the slider role in ARIA comes with a bunch of extra attributes, which I'm going to add now. ARIA value min equals 0. ARIA value max equals 5. ARIA value now equals 3. And just to be a little bit more clear, ARIA-value text equals 3 stars. So instead of just saying that the value is 3 out of 5, we can give it a special label and say 3 stars. So we haven't made this interactive yet, but let's go ahead and see exactly what happens.
Rate from 1 to 5 stars. 3 stars min 0 max 5. Slider.
That came a little fast, and if you didn't quite hear it, it said that it was a slider. It said that there was a min 0, max 5, and that the current value is 3 stars. So this is great. Now, the only other thing we need to do is make this actually interactive with the keyboard. I went ahead and built the key handler earlier, so I can just write return star key.
You're outside of the tag.
Oh, thanks. I'll fix that in a second. And if I did this right, cool, now it's
Rate from
interactive.
1 to 5. 4 stars min 0 max 5. 3 stars min 0 max 5.
So notice that simply by adding the keyboard handler support, because this is properly marked up with ARIA, and because my keyboard handler modifies the ARIA attributes dynamically, the screen reader automatically does the right thing. It speaks the new value when the control changes. So that's the star rating gadget example. And let's do one more, which is the pop-up dialog. So you saw earlier that we had a dialog, and the accessibility problem with the dialog, I don't even need a screen reader to demonstrate this. You start with a button, and you click on the button, and it opens a dialog, but focus isn't inside the dialog. So you saw how this is a bad experience for just about all the users that we're considering here. So the first change I'd like to make is just to focus the OK button when we enter the dialog. A simple change like this is going to create a much better experience for a keyboard-only user. Now, the initial focus is inside the dialog. Now let's focus on the screen reader user, and I'm going to say role equals dialog on the outer dialog element there, and I'm going to do one more thing here, which is add aria-label. This is optional, but it'll create an even better experience. We can call this a confirmation dialog.
Bar less focus equals dollar.
So now let's turn on Chromebox and see what happens.
Buy more printer ink button.
Okay, so buy more printer ink button. Now I'm going to click this and see what happens.
Entering dialog confirmation. OK button.
Great, so this said entering dialog confirmation. So now we know that I'm inside a dialog and that I'm in an OK button. So this is already a much better experience before. There's only one more problem, which is that it's possible for me to escape outside the dialog.
Cancel button. Refresh button. Exiting dialog.
So this wasn't a terrible experience. At least it told me that I exited the dialog, but that isn't exactly the experience that I would like to deliver for users as a developer. I'd like to actually keep focus trapped inside the dialog because I want the user to either press the OK button or the cancel button. And so we can do that with just a little bit of JavaScript, but it's a little more JavaScript than I want to type live, and so I typed it ahead of time, and I'm going to paste it in here. But essentially all it's doing is adding some event listeners. And if I pasted that in the right place, great. So what's happening now is that even as I keep pressing tab, it's keeping me inside the dialog. And if I press shift tab, it's going to keep me there. You can see it flicker a little bit, because what's happening is the browser is allowing the focus to move outside the dialog. I'm listening on the focus event and just moving it right back inside. And this is something that works for screen readers. It works for people who are using the keyboard, and this creates a much better experience. One last, ooh, it really wants to keep things trapped inside the dialog. Okay, one last compatibility note. We've designed all of these examples to work with not just Chromevox and Chrome OS, but all the examples we showed you is standard HTML5. It's part of the ARIA standard, and it's part of just standard HTML5 and JavaScript that you've been using for a while. And all these examples work across a variety of browsers and popular screen readers and magnifiers. We listed some of them here on the page. There are some platform differences, but the good news is that a couple of years ago, this would have been difficult to deliver to very many users. And today, the latest versions of browsers and the latest versions of mini screen readers already support everything you saw here, and so you can deliver this great, accessible, interactive experience from a single code base.
So now that you've seen all of our different examples and seen how we're using the advice that we're giving today, I just wanted to do a quick recap of what we've said. Number one, use clean HTML and standard tags. Remember that clean HTML is generally more accessible HTML. And this is important to do first as opposed to later. Number two, manage focus. Make sure that your custom interactive elements, your fancy divs and spans with on-click handlers, have tab index on them, and that they can receive keyboard focus. And this is, you can also then proactively manage your focus by using the JavaScript focus method and by listening to how the user is trying to move focus around the page. The third thing is making sure that your controls are usable with the keyboard. Add key handlers. Make sure that a user doesn't have to have a mouse in order to use your fancy slider widgets. And finally, add ARIA for screen readers. And the good thing here is that if you've already done the first 3 steps, it should be easy to find the correct ARIA role for the control that you're trying to build. And if you can't find one that matches exactly, find one that approximates the interaction style that you want. And make sure that you're updating your dynamic states and properties, and make sure that you're identifying your live regions to the user.
I have one more note that I'd like to make here, which is that this is something that didn't come up with Chromevox, but is an issue with a few screen readers, which is that some screen readers are modal. And by modal, all I mean is that the screen readers have a mode where all of the keys the user press go directly to the screen reader and not to the web page or any other app. This can be convenient because it means you don't have to hold down modifier keys while you're interacting with the screen reader. But the problem is that you can't, as a web developer, assume that someone who's using a screen reader is able to always press keys that your application can listen to. But luckily, there's a very easy solution, which is that whenever the user has focused a control, then any keys they press are going to be sent to that focused control. So if you just keep that in mind, and just remember that global key handlers may not always work, but that keys on specific focused controls will work, then you can build something that'll be compatible with the majority of screen readers out there. There's one alternative for more advanced developers, which is the ARIA role application. You can set a certain part of the page or the entire page to be a web application which listens to all keyboard events and sends nothing to the screen reader. There are some caveats when working with this, but this can be a great way that you can build a very custom experience if you want to do that.
So in the last part of our talk, we want to talk about some of the opportunities that are available out there if you're a developer interested in accessibility, which I'm sure all of you are. So, but first, before I start talking about the cool things that you can do, I want to talk about some of the limitations that are out there, unfortunately. Specifically with some of the advice that we gave you, like ARIA, there are wide implementation differences at this time between browsers, platforms, and screen readers. And what is implemented can be buggy and quirky. If your user base is customers who are using older browsers and older screen readers, at this time, the best way to reach those customers is still writing a static HTML page. So if that's your customer base, a static HTML page is the best way to reach them. But you guys are here at Google I/O. You want to learn about cool emerging tech. And the great thing about ARIA is that it's kind of in the same place as HTML5 generally. The spec is really ambitious. And it's implemented in some places better than it's implemented in other places. But at the same time, there's a lot of stuff that works really well everywhere. And we showed you a few of those today. So there's no reason to wait until things settle down to start hacking and building cool tools with the stuff that is available.
So we want to talk a little bit about the power of browser extensions. You know that we've been demoing these things using ChromeVox, which is built as a browser extension. And browser extensions in the last couple of years have really become a lot more powerful because you don't have to restart your browser anymore when you want to install an extension. You don't have to worry as much about what types of privileges that extension might have. You know exactly what sites and what things it has access to. And because of all of this, we think that browser extensions are a perfect platform not only for accessibility solutions for end users, like we've been demonstrating with ChromeVox, but also for developers who want to test things out for accessibility and who want additional tools to help make their websites more accessible. So we'd like to talk about 3 of Google's extensions that we've developed that you might find useful or inspirational for other ideas or extensions that you might be interested in building.
So the first one we want to talk about, of course, is ChromeVox. It's built into Chrome OS, but because it's a Chrome extension, you can install it on Chrome on any platform and use it as a screen reader inside the browser. It's implemented as JavaScript, which means that it's basically built for the web. It uses the new Chrome experimental TTS API to do text-to-speech, and it also uses some special Chrome OS APIs to listen for user interface events in the Chrome of Chrome, which means that when you have your Chrome OS, your Chromebook that some of you are going to be getting, it actually will speak the sign-in dialog. It will speak the menus that you open in order to change the settings. And so that's really great, too. It's speaking the Chrome of Chrome for you. And for ChromeVox, the goal is really to have the best support for HTML5 and ARIA because this is a screen reader for the web. And if you want to go beyond that, we also support custom scripts that you as a developer can add to your site if you want to add the extra level of interactive accessibility beyond what ARIA and HTML5 allow you to offer. The second extension that we've done is called ChromeViz. And this is an extension that we made for low vision users. It's basically a type of screen magnifier. We released it last summer. And the goal with ChromeViz was to kind of take advantage of the power of extensions to allow users to customize their entire web experience. There's a lot of different types of low vision users. They all have different needs. And ChromeViz allows them to modify almost everything about this magnified lens. Basically, users will select text on the page, and ChromeViz will display that selected text in this special lens. And users can change the color, they can change the size of the text, they can even change the position of the lens. And so we really see extensions as a really powerful way to allow users to customize their entire world on the web. And ChromeViz was an example of that.
The last extension I want to talk about is called ChromeShades, which we just released. And this is different. It's an accessibility tool entirely for developers. And in fact, it's entirely for sighted developers, because I found myself as a sighted developer who was interested in building more web applications that are accessible to people with screen readers and magnifiers and other assistive technology. The problem I found is that because I'm not a screen reader user, it was a little bit cumbersome for me to keep turning on a screen reader, testing out my application, then turning it off, going back to coding, because keeping it on all the time and jabbering is not the experience I'm used to. So I wanted a tool that would help me find and identify accessibility problems quickly without going through the same experience. And so ChromeShades transforms your web page into a visual experience that helps highlight potential accessibility problems. It highlights which controls are focusable and interactive and different roles, whether using ARIA or whether using native controls. You can continue to interact with your application just as you would normally, so you can test out your whole application and visually see at a glance if there are any problems, which can be a lot faster for development. So the source code to all of these extensions is available on Google Code. Of course, everything here is open source. And if you're interested in how any of these things work, or if you have ideas on how you could build on any of these extensions or the ideas behind them to make things accessible to different users, or just to get an idea how to make your own web app accessible, you can check out the source code or interact with us by taking a look at that.
And we're also at the Developer Sandbox, so if you want to talk to us in person and maybe try out some of these extensions, we'd be more than happy to demo those for you. But we've reached the end of our presentation, so I wanted to leave you with a few final thoughts. First of which is that, as we said at the beginning of the presentation, an accessible website does not have to be a static, slow HTML site. With just a little bit more work, you can deliver to your users an interactive, dynamic experience that's going to be fun for them to use. And the first step down this road, as I said, as I was stalling for time, is just unplug your mouse. All you have to do is unplug your mouse and try out your app or your favorite web app, and you really might be surprised at what you find. It's the quickest way to figure out what the problems are for users that aren't going to be using a mouse to access your site. And finally, HTML5 and ARIA are going to get you the rest of the way there. With just a little bit of extra work, you can really give users of assistive technology an experience that rivals the experience of any other user without building a separate page. So it can be the same page for everybody. And that's really the goal here. So we hope you enjoyed the presentation. We hope that you learned something. We have a feedback link at the top. It's goo.gl/E_W_A_QJ, if you wrote that down. We also have hashtags if you can tweet about the presentation. And of course, the presentation code is on our Google Code site. And feel free to stop by the sandbox and talk to us in person.
Any questions while we're right here? Yeah, someone's coming up.
I looked on the web store for those extensions you were just talking about. I found ChromeShades and ChromeViz, but ChromeVox was not listed. The reason why ChromeVox is not on the web store is because it uses the experimental TTS API. And because that's still experimental, we can't put it on the gallery. So how do you install it then?
On our Google Code site, you can actually get the package CRX, and you can actually also build it from source.
Thank you.
So yeah, as soon as the TTS extension becomes part of stable Chrome, we'll definitely put this on the web store. And we're planning also a separate launch with more features to integrate with Chrome on platforms other than Chrome OS. Today, we're essentially launching for all users on Chrome OS, and essentially for developers who are more comfortable doing things like building from source or downloading and installing the extensions separately. So essentially, this launch of ChromeVox on other platforms is for the audience here, developers.
Hello? Oh, okay. So about managing the focus on dialogues, is there any other way to keep the focus from escaping that dialogue? Instead of using JavaScript, like using ARIA role or property or something like that?
So that's a really good question. The question is there any other way to keep focus inside of something like a dialogue? I've experimented with this a bit in different browsers and screen readers. There is no one solution that works across all browsers and screen readers other than listening for focus events, because focus is not a cancelable event as part of the HTML standard. So this is by design. You can listen to the focus event and move it back. There's one exception, which is that if you're using Safari on Mac OS X, it implements the dialog role slightly differently, so that it actually treats the dialog as essentially a separate region of the page, and by default, all of the control will be trapped within the dialog in Safari with the Mac screen reader. So users get a slightly better experience there, and they can choose to escape the dialog with one extra step. But across other browsers, right now, there isn't a solution for that. That's something we're definitely considering for Chromebox, so it's a good question.
Okay, thanks.
Another question here.
Yeah, does ARIA validates on W3C validator, HTML5 validator, those kind of tools?
The question was, does ARIA validate with W3C validators? There might be some ARIA tags that do, but the experience we've had is that validators work great for static web pages, and they're not going to help in order to determine whether something really is accessible. Validators should be recognizing ARIA tags as valid syntax, so they should tell you that the syntax is correct, but they're not going to tell you whether you've actually semantically implemented things correctly. It's a little bit beyond what a validator can do. But since this is part of the HTML5 standard, there's no reason it shouldn't validate.
Beyond what you already talked about, making an accessible website that's also dynamic and interesting, do you foresee any issues of being Section 508 compliant?
Can you elaborate on the question? You're asking what other issues do you see in being Section 508 compliant? Do you mean from the perspective of a web developer, what else they need to do? I
was thinking more like making an HTML5 website. Are there particular complications to being Section 508 compliant that go beyond just what you've recommended in this session?
So what I would say there is that Section 508 compliance, for people who don't know, it's a compliance standard that essentially gives a checklist of a bunch of different ways in which a website or lots of other types of products should be accessible to people with a wide range of disabilities. Section 508 compliance is mostly, at least for the web, focused on things that are a little bit more static, or just things like whether something can be interacted with at all. There are a lot of things that we didn't cover in this presentation because there's a lot of resources on it. For example, a lot of people are colorblind or have partial low vision, so they might need larger fonts. We didn't talk about those issues because they don't relate to interactivity. We've been just talking about the issue of interactivity. And for interactivity, the things we've talked about in working with ARIA, specifically the ARIA roles to deal with interactive controls and managing focus and keyboard handlers, those are the things you need to do in order to make something work when you've got an interactive website. But there are tons of other aspects to accessibility. Most of those are not necessarily affected just because you have an interactive Web 2.0 app as opposed to like a more static web page. So there's tons of resources on all the other types of accessibility, and if you want, we could talk about some of those offline. And, oh, another question coming up.
HTML5 is also about mobile applications. Is there any support of ARIA in mobile browsers? And how do you deal with focus issues on multi-touch devices, for instance?
That's a really good question. There is some ARIA support in mobile browsers already. Right now, there's a great support on the iPhone and iOS devices, and you'll see some cool things coming to Android at some point. But yeah, focus is definitely something that can be different. Right now, I guess I'll just say that, that on iOS, there is a concept of focus when people are using the voiceover on iOS. And so a lot of these things do apply. But we could probably do a whole talk on accessibility for mobile, which is definitely a different experience.
It's definitely something that's really an emerging field. I mean, if you think back, even a few years ago, it was only static websites that you could see on mobile. So this is definitely something where there's a lot of changes happening very fast.
That's a very good question, though.
Thanks.
Okay, I don't see any other questions, but we'll be up here if anyone wants to talk to us about anything else, and thank you very much.
Thank you.